Have you ever wondered, gee, should we just homeschool? If so, you aren't alone. As parents, we face unique challenges in these modern times, and the traditional educational landscape is under scrutiny like never before. From academic stress to navigating complex safety concerns, it's no wonder more and more parents are exploring the idea of homeschooling. Well, today we have a very special guest joining us, a homeschooling veteran, a devoted mother of 7, you heard me, and an advocate for developmentally appropriate education. Jennifer Pepito's journey as a homeschooling parent spans an impressive 25 years, during which she successfully graduated 5 of her children from her homeschool program, with 2 earning honors degrees from their preferred universities and 1 currently pursuing a JD. But what sets Jennifer apart is her unwavering commitment to helping families homeschool in a way that's both developmentally appropriate and spiritually nourishing. Amidst the complexities of the world, she has dedicated herself to creating an enriching and safe educational environment for her children and wants to share her wisdom with you. Well, I'm sure looking forward to hearing it. Jennifer, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Meg. I'm so grateful for this opportunity to talk with your community.
You bet. A lot of mothers are out there listening, and I think a lot of them are resonating with what we're saying. I know as a grandmother, I worry about my grandkids. I worry about the safety of the school. I worry about what they're being taught. I worry about what they're not being taught. I worry about the peers that they're coming in contact with. And it's very disturbing. And so really, it seems like in the past 5 years, the angst that a lot of parents, particularly moms, are feeling around schools is increasing. So talk to us about homeschooling and what changes you've seen in homeschooling over the past 20 years.
I started homeschooling 25 years ago. We were in a small church and there was a family there who had a really sweet relationship. The children and the parents talked really sweetly together and there seemed to be a lot of love. And so we saw that example and thought, man, this is more what we want in our family than some of the other things we saw, which were a lot of disconnected families. And so we set out, 25 years ago with our oldest being just 3 years old and read about a method called Charlotte Mason where you actually ditch a lot of textbooks and workbooks in favor of reading aloud together and talking about the books you read. And at the time, I was also studying the Montessori method, which is very hands-on and developmentally appropriate. And so as I started researching education and spending more time with my own children, I developed my own framework, my own what I call a living education, where we really highlight relationships and connection, because I'm sure, as you know in your studies, attached children are much more successful adults than children who struggle with attachment disorders. Yep. Connected families are so much more whole and healthy than families where there's a lot of disconnection and conflict and dysfunction. And so what I was really pursuing isn't just a better education for my children, but also a really close relationship and healthy spiritual life. And so, in 20 years, it's one of the most wonderful things is that there are a lot of families now who were homeschooled and they are homeschooling. And so maybe in their families, there was some imbalance. Like I know the show just came out, Shiny Happy People, which really highlighted some imbalances among some homeschool families where maybe behavior was elevated above development. But there's been enough hindsight that I think homeschool families now, the world is their oyster because we have so many classes available and beautiful curriculum and so much support. For years, I was a podcast host for the Wild and Free community. And there's, these beautiful big conferences, 1,000 women just all together, very excited. And there's groups. And so there's so much support now for homeschool families. It's not a lonely journey by any stretch of the imagination. And, I think for many of us now who are like, okay, I used to think homeschooling was weird. Like I've had several friends who they when I first met them, they were not homeschooling, and their husbands were like, I don't want to homeschool because it would make my kids weird. And then they got to know my kids and they're like, well, they're not weird, or maybe
Mhm.
they're weird in a good way. And so they started their own homeschool journey. And so I think that now there's just so many more examples and people that you can actually know who are doing this. And for many of us, I think a big motivation at this point is we want to save childhood. Like children don't need to learn about some of the things they're learning about in public
Mhm.
schools. They don't need to learn
Mhm.
about it yet. They can think about fairy tales and princesses and beauty and nature and puppies that talk. And there's just so many more
Right.
interesting and wonderful things for children to learn about than a lot of the social issues that are being promoted to very young children. It's
Yeah.
not child friendly anymore. The schools are not child friendly. And I don't think they have been for a long time, because if you read people like John Taylor Gatto, he was a teacher of the year in New York State. I mean, he feels like he passed away sadly, but he was an advocate for alternative education because the form of schooling that we are still pushing on children is not effective for development. It's not effective for their soul. It teaches
Mhm.
them to be mere like workbook checkers and bell ringers, and just it's not a natural way of learning, and it's a very modern experiment. It's a modern
Mhm.
experiment that children would have to sit for 6 hours a day when developmentally they should be moving, their bodies should be engaging in their learning. It's a and especially, kindergarten used to be cutting and pasting and coloring and drawing and listening to stories. And now it's testing and workbooks.
Mhm.
And so,
Mhm.
education is different than it was when they first
Mhm.
started more of a public education or institutional education. So it's different than it was. And the results are worse every year. I think
Mhm.
California, there is a study that a couple of professors from Stanford did that just found how much learning loss happened over COVID. And it gets worse every year. Like every year they're having to lower the standards and lower the expectations because it's not an effective way to learn, to sit in a classroom all day and be bored out of your mind. I think it was Plato who said the only real education is self-education. The rest is a mere veneer.
That's very compelling. And I think that I've seen huge changes in homeschooling. I remember when our kids were growing up, I wanted to homeschool each of them for third or fourth grade. But at that time, there weren't many people homeschooling. And I think there were one or two curricula out there and nobody else was doing it. And they didn't want to feel like oddballs. And now it's completely changed. And I've seen a huge swell in the number of parents in my practice who are homeschooling their kids. I'd love to see some research on the percentage of kids that are identified as ADHD in the homeschool community versus the public school community. Because I've always believed that if you have a bouncy boy who has difficulty sitting still, he needs to move. And a lot of times what'll happen is the teacher will get angry at him. He's in third or fourth or fifth grade, and they make him stay in for recess. And I thought the kid needs a big tree in the playground at school or at home. Do you know anything about that?
Brian Ray has done a lot of homeschool research. I have not seen research on ADD, but I think you're absolutely right. So much of the reason that children get medicated in school is because they can't sit still. Whereas in homeschooling, I have a couple of kids who have sensory processing issues or just maybe a little bit on the ADD spectrum, and they can sit on a ball to do their work. That's why I've got a yoga ball all over my house.
Mhm.
They can sit on a ball to do their work. They can stand up when I'm doing our read aloud time. They can be playing with Legos. We incorporate a lot of movement into our home because boys were not made, I don't know that any of us were made to sit for 6 hours at a time,
No.
and really very short breaks. Like you get two recesses and a lunch break. So I don't think any of us were made to live like that.
Yeah.
And so of course ADD is skyrocketing in family, in institutional schools. Whereas in a homeschool, there's just so many more accommodations you can make to help those children to learn at their own pace and in their own way.
Talk about the subjects that are critical in teaching in homeschooling, because I think a lot of parents are concerned about what's being taught in public schools and private schools. So academically, where is your focus with homeschooling?
Yeah, I love that question because we use what is called a Charlotte Mason education. And what we realize is that in in language arts, for instance, so many schools spend most of the day on math and language arts and very little time on art or history or science. And yet, language arts, what is it? It is the ability to compose beautiful sentences, to communicate in a beautiful and clear way.
Mhm.
And how do you learn to communicate well? Well, in schools, they think it's by reading short, boring, age appropriate sentences and then answering questions about it. Or, maybe underlining the verbs or in whatever way they they bisect the parts of language arts and do all these different classes or workbooks for the different parts of language arts. Well, in a
Mhm.
Charlotte Mason homeschool, instead of having our children do a grammar workbook, a spelling workbook, a reading workbook, a handwriting workbook, a writing workbook, instead we read beautiful books together. We read several chapters a day. Maybe we'll read out of a literature selection like The Horse and His Boy by
Mhm.
C.S. Lewis. We would
Wow.
then also read something from science, for instance, Galileo by Jean Bendick. And then maybe we would read a history resource as well. Our Island Story is one that some of us have been reading. So we'll read from maybe 3 different books during what we call morning time. And then as we read, our children might be copying sentences from the books. Last year, my children copied Gerard Manley Hopkins' poetry. The world is charged with the grandeur of God.
Mhm.
It's sprung out like shook foil. Like it's a beautiful
Is
poem. Like,
wonderful. Yep.
yeah.
Yep.
So they copy that or they copy scripture. They will write about what we read, or we might just talk about it. And so instead of having all these tedious workbooks in one year, I might also add in a grammar resource for the year. Julie Bogart of Brave Learner talks about focusing on grammar just 3 times in your child's educational career because they're learning as they listen to these beautiful stories. As they read quality literature, they are learning how to compose beautiful words
Right.
and sentences and how to communicate beautifully. So they don't
Yep.
need all these workbooks that end up being just busy work. I mean, schools have to keep children sitting still and quiet and busy. And so they stack on all this tedium. But in the
Mhm.
homeschool, we can be a lot more efficient, reading out loud. And so we do cover all the subjects. We cover all the humanities. In my homeschool, we look at art at least once a week, fine art. We read from poetry, history, science, the Bible, and literature. And that's a big core of our learning. And then math is so important. I think that homeschoolers get a bad rap for being behind in math. But what I've
Mhm.
found is we can outsource. As I get into the higher levels of math, I will put my children in either a college class. Dual enrollment is free in many states for high school students. Or in our town, we live in a very small town, and there's still a co-op that offers math and science classes. So I think that all of the same subjects, as far as history, science, art, math, language arts, they're all as important in homeschools as they are in public schools. But I think, unfortunately, in public schools, there's so much classroom management that has to happen that a lot of
Yep.
the actual learning gets squeezed out for classroom management. And then the learning that there is, it's not as tailored. Like our family loves the Bible. We love art. We love missions and travel and learning about other people. And so our homeschool is tailored to our diverse interests. And I think that's another beauty of homeschooling is that you don't have to just follow a certain scope and sequence. Obviously, there's basics that all children should learn about civic responsibility and character and basic core of knowledge. But I think that from family to family, we can highlight what is actually interesting and exciting for our own families and create a beautiful culture around what we love.
Mhm. What about parents who say, well, and you probably went through this, I've got multiple kids, multiple ages that I'm dealing with. How do I give adequate attention to each child when their needs are different? And how do I turn to my left and teach a kindergartner and then turn to my right and help my 16-year-old with math?
Yeah.
How did you do that?
Well, that's such a good question. I mean, at one time, I did have up to 6 students in my homeschool because I have 7 kids. And it is hard when you're getting to those grade specific subjects like math, for instance. But with the Peaceful Press, my curriculum company, our resources are family style. So for instance, many of our families are using our Playful Pioneers resource. And in these resources, we read through the Little House on the Prairie books or the Little Britches books. And then for the older children, there's an independent reading list. And so the older kids are going to read a little bit more from that list. And then the younger children will just stay with the main literature readings. And then we have student sheets. So the older children will copy their own work. The younger children will trace some words. So most of our core subjects, history, science, literature, are done together. And then we just have to break up into our age level for math and maybe grammar or phonics. Like a younger child might be doing phonics, an older doing grammar. And I found some really good resources that are easier to use. For instance, there's a book called Explode the Code. It's very easy for children to use. It's a great phonics resource, and it doesn't take a lot of parental guidance for that. So a kindergartner could be working on that while you help a high schooler understand essays. But then there are also so many online resources now, like Khan Academy is an amazing resource for homeschooling, especially those upper levels. During COVID, they sent out a really helpful email with kind of like a grade by grade how to use Khan Academy. I'm sure that's still available on their website, but just they have a plethora of videos explaining any difficult math concept or any difficult science or history or language arts concept that you could think of. They have a free video to explain it. So it is actually very easy. And the other thing is we will combine grade levels. For instance, if I had a 4th grader and a 6th grader, I might do one 5th grade math or grammar with both of them because there is a lot of review as you go. And so, combining a grade level and maybe you have to work a little bit more with the younger one, but that at least eliminates one teacher book and one set of grading. It can be combined with a few ages because, like I said, so much of it cycles through and repeats. And so you just combine those grades instead of trying to manage, say, 4 different teacher manuals.
Are kids who go through homeschooling through high school handicapped when it comes to getting into good colleges?
Not at all. My own children and I would call myself a relaxed homeschooler. I'm not super ambitious because it's not a big value of mine to, for instance, get my kids into Ivy League college. However, I still, several of my children did apply for private Christian colleges and earned scholarship money with their SAT scores. So it's easy. And they did that right after high school. They ended up using the community college system and being able to get through university debt free. And so, we decided what our value was a debt free education. Maybe we'll change in the future. But yeah, my children right out of high school, based on their SAT scores, were able to get scholarship money to great Christian colleges like there's one up in Gordon College was one that my daughter applied at and got scholarship money. Simpson College, another one applied at and got scholarship money. And then the daughter who's finishing her dissertation for a Juris Doctorate has been going to Queen's University in Northern Ireland.
Wow. That's pretty impressive. Let's turn and talk about your book, which is, I love the concept of it. And your book, Mothering by the Book, The Power of Reading Aloud to Overcome Fear and Recapture Joy. Your chapters all revolve around fear. Let literature free us from fear. Overcome the fear of the baby years. Overcome the feel of failure. Overcome the fear of my children being behind through balance. How did you come to write so much about fear?
I think moms just deal with a lot of anxiety. I'm sure you've encountered that in the moms that you've dealt with in your practice. We care so much, and often that ends up looking like fear, like, oh, don't jump on the trampoline or don't go outside or don't, there's so many things that we're worried about. But what I realized in my own life is that my fears for my children, I wanted to give them a perfect life and a perfect childhood, but my fears surrounding that were actually robbing them of a perfect childhood because then I ended up kind of being up in my head and worried. And I had this sort of grimace on my face a lot of the time, instead of just really enjoying my time with them, enjoying this short season of motherhood. And so, I really wrote that book as a love letter to young moms, because it's so destructive to our children. We think that we're just being good moms by constantly worrying and being afraid and being so anxious and concerned, but it does steal a lot of the fun out of
Mhm.
parenting. And you see, the problem is when our kids look at our faces and they see us looking so worried and anxious, they think that they are the cause of our unhappiness. We're
Right.
just concerned. We just want them to be happy, but they look at us looking so unhappy and they think they've made us unhappy. And there's so many
Yeah.
small things like, did my children fall behind on school over the summer? Will my children be able to get into college? Like, we project so far in the future with these big fears, and then we end up stealing the joy of the present. And so it was just a call to moms to really learn to take those thoughts captive. I think a lot of times our fears originate in childhood trauma. And so for me, I developed a practice of just asking Jesus, like, where did this start? What's going on that I'm feeling so anxious about what seems like a small thing? Even driving in a car, I've had a couple of my kids get in fender benders, or not injury related accidents, but small ones. And then I realized I was getting very anxious being in a car. And so I needed to just take that to the Lord and ask him to show me what was true about that situation, and comfort me. And, I realized in that whole process that as a child, I had been in a car accident with my parents, and
Mm.
nobody was hurt, but it was a very big memory. And so in that experience of realizing, oh, there's some car related stuff going on, I really invited Jesus to comfort me and shed some light on that experience, which then I think diffuses a lot of the adult anxiety around these experiences. When we can figure it out and heal some of that childhood trauma. I loved the book by Kobe Campbell, Why Am I Like This? She's a psychologist and she wrote a book called Why Am I Like This? And she talks a lot about that kind of process of learning to heal some of our childhood memories so that we can be more relaxed and happy and comfort, regulated adults is the way they say it.
Right. I love it. A lot of parents are fearing that they will fail, and they're also fearing that their children won't have a good future. So, talk to us first about parents, mothers in particular, feeling like they're going to fail their children and what
Yeah,
they
I
should
think
do.
yeah, I think that's so common, and it's interesting. I'm reading a story right now about a man who became a I think a renowned or at least successful minister in his circle of influence, and just what a terrible childhood he'd had, and what horrible problems he'd even had in young adult. And there are so many books like that. Another one I just read talked about a woman who had some problems as an adult woman, and it kind of traced back to some of her childhood experiences. And so the truth is, we will fail. The truth
Mhm.
is, we will try our best as parents, but we will make mistakes. We will fail, and our children will struggle as well. Adam, my friend said this to me. Adam was in the garden with the perfect father, and he still screwed up so bad that it brought sin into the world for all of us. And so for
Mhm.
any of us as mothers to think that we could be perfect and we would not fail and our children would never have any problems is a pipe dream. And so I think it's better early on to realize, what, I'm going to do my best to mother these children. They're gifts from God, and I'm going to do my best. But I'm also going to have the humility to realize I'm not so powerful that up to me, I can ruin them on my own. And I'm not so weak that it's all me, whatever happens. And so just take each day as it comes and really enjoy the day, love the day. It's interesting. I think about my own parents, like they had both of them a little bit of a rougher childhood in a sense. I mean, big families or not a lot of money or things like that. And and then as parents, I mean, they had their own trials while they were parenting myself and my four siblings. And yet we all in many ways are successful adults. And so I think we put too much pressure on ourselves and maybe even cause more problems for our children by these high expectations and these worries that we will fail them. I think that some of the kids who turn out maybe the most adjusted are the ones who maybe had parents who were a little bit more relaxed and less
Mhm.
worried about the outcome. I think just do your best, enjoy your children, become a better person yourself, and it will work out. There was a book called Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids. I don't remember the name
Mm.
of the author, but he talked about that in the book, how generally your children are going to turn out about like you. So just do your best to be a good person, do your best to be a good parent, and don't worry so much.
Mhm. You're absolutely right because kids grow up to sort of repeat what they know, what's familiar. And I've had a number of girls say, I will never grow up and yell at my kids the way my parents yelled at me, and so on and so forth. And then they grow up to yell at their kids. So the very best thing that we can do is to relax and be kind to our kids and just be as good as we can. I forget a sobering day I had with my son when he was 18. One day he looked down at me, he was quite tall, and he said, Mom, quit treating me like there's always something wrong with me. And I was stunned. And I thought, well, there's nothing wrong with you. But what I was projecting onto him was my worry that there would be something wrong and something would hurt him and I wouldn't be able to, so our worry and our concern really goes onto our kids and they wear it just like you were talking about. And I think that, fearful parents can create fear in their kids. That doesn't make parents feel very good because parents who are struggling with anxiety might think, well, that makes me feel worse. No, the whole point is, deal with your own anxiety and to be the happiest person that you can and the calmest person to embrace life and accept life. And that's exactly what's going to happen with your kids. Did you have any kids who had any kind of behavior issues or learning issues or any difficulty that you had to help them struggle with?
Yeah. And I just want to say one more thing to what you said. You talked about the mom who yelled at her kids, even though she swore she never would. And one of the best things I've done as a mom actually is forgive my parents. I wish I'd done it earlier, but I think that when we parent on a pendulum, like my parents were like this, and so I'm going to be like this, we're doing it in a reaction. And so it's so much better if we just take time to really forgive your parents. And that might mean journaling about all the things they did that were wrong, but
Hmm.
taking time just really forgive them in a thorough way can release us to parent on a more steady path instead of out of a reaction. And yes, to answer that question, Meg, I have an adult daughter who has special needs. She's somewhere it's, very difficult to pinpoint because some people said auditory processing and other people said low IQ or developmental disability. And so not an easy one to even pin down to figure out what exactly it was. But because of that, we did a lot of occupational therapy. We used someone called a neurodevelopmentalist. She had sensory processing disorder. And so we learned some helpful clues there. And this is one of the reasons I created the Peaceful Preschool is because many children are a little bit lacking in those motor skills because of the lifestyle that we have. So much time on screens and so little sensory play early on. And so, I created the Peaceful Preschool really to help parents just do some of that sort of occupational therapy type activities earlier so that when your children do hit the academic years, it's easier for them to learn because they say autism now is like 50% or something of kids are dealing with autism. So really a high percentage of children are dealing with some kind of, whether it's a processing disorder, autism, ADD. And I do think there are things we can do in early childhood and no worries about it, but there are better practices in early childhood, taking care of their health in a better way, maybe making sure that you're doing those developmentally appropriate large motor and fine motor skills building can be really helpful for helping them learn. And that daughter, she loves to read and she's very organized. And so has developed a lot of skills, I think, through some of the stuff that we've done. And, I've had children who might have been diagnosed in other ways, ADD or some of those other kind of issues that children deal with. But we try to live a really holistic lifestyle where we have a good balance of outside time and vitamins and a awareness of how screens affect our mental health. And so I think, there are just better practices as parents, I think, that even if you do have a child with behavior issues or on the spectrum, some of these maybe more healthy or holistic practices can help allay some of those, the effects of that on your family.
One of the things that I try to get through to parents, which is difficult for them to receive, is that if you have a child who has behavior disorder, the answer is more time with their parents, not less. And this is hard for parents to wrap their minds around because they think, no, 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 you don't understand. I need to send this 16-year-old away to get fixed. And I said, no, what they really need is more time with you. I don't like the analogy, but people, you'll understand what I'm saying. When you are training a puppy and the puppy starts to act up, what you do is you tie the puppy to your waist so that you're with it all the time, so that you can catch bad behaviors and start to curb them. In a way, teenagers are like that. A lot of them act up if they're not getting enough attention or enough time with their parents.
Yeah.
And one of the benefits that I've seen, I'd love to hear you weigh in on this with homeschooling, is that kids get very comfortable being with adults, communicating with adults, and treating adults as adults, not peers. And I think this really helps them. What is your experience with behavior issues with other homeschooled kids and parents?
Yeah, I love that you brought that up, Meg, because I actually was I had a child who was a little bit angry. And I was talking to my counselor about it. And I asked, should I bring the child in? What should we do? And she said, the more that you as parents, you and your husband deal with your own anger or angst or your own dysregulation, the more calm your child will be. So I think often our children are just reflecting our own inner emotional state. And maybe we have more self-control. And so we can, be more respectful in our workplace or whatever it is, but they don't necessarily have that external controls to be able to hold down what they're feeling, which often is coming from us. And so, there are things like with the Peaceful Press, we have something called a connection challenge. It's linked in my Instagram, and it's a 10-day connection challenge where every day you look your child in the eyes for 10 seconds, you give them a 30-second hug, you read aloud together, and you play outside. And some of these, for a teenager, maybe that's going to be more like you take a walk with them instead of playing outside, and maybe you sit and read together or look at something together, even play a game together. But I think that, children, a hug releases serotonin. Eye contact helps children feel attached, which makes them more mature behaviorally. Gordon Neufeld wrote a book called Hold On to Your Kids. And he talked about just how important attachment is to responsible adult behavior. If children are just sent away, and this is why I'm not a fan of a parenting method that tells you to send your children away when they're not being fun, because really a child who's misbehaving, like you said, needs more time with you. They need to feel loved by you, and they also need your direction and your attention, your concentrated effort. And I know sometimes this feels like a lot, but the problem is if we don't do it when they're young, we're going to be doing it later. Like we're going to be spending time in court with them, or we're going to be spending money on therapies because and not that everything can be avoided by better early childhood parenting. I'm not trying to say that. Sometimes things just happen, but I do believe there are better practices like more eye contact, more connection earlier on that can help children learn to regulate better as adults, learn not to be thrill seekers as adults. Some of the early childhood practices do result in more comfortable and regulated adults. And that, that connection piece, like you said, is an important part of that.
Huge. Well, Jennifer, I could talk to you for another hour and a half, but we've run out of time. And I think it's important for parents, if they want to learn more, which I'm sure they will after our interview, to check out your fantastic book, Mothering by the Book. And, I think you've done a beautiful job of encouraging parents that we don't need to be perfect. We just need to do the best job we can. How can parents find you or learn about you and the work that you do?
Oh, thanks for asking, Meg. Motheringbythebook.com is where they can get the book. And at that spot, that webpage, there's also a course with my daughter and I talking through some of the practices in the book. And those are the practices that I've talked about in this episode, practices like forgiveness or taking your thoughts captive, things that can help you be a more calm and present parent. And then also on my Instagram, Jennifer Pepito, there's a link for that connection challenge, which I think is just an amazing way to build that connection so your children will respond to your values and your direction.
And I think every parent should do that, whether you have a great relationship with your child or a strained one, behavior issues, or a child with ADHD. Every child benefits and every parent benefits by building a deeper attachment to their kids. And I do want to encourage parents out there who really struggle with kids who are in the teen years. You can get them back. You can build a stronger relationship. Don't give up because their bad behavior is all about wanting more from you. Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for joining me. And I hope your book sells gazillion copies because it's very, very important for any parent to read. So thank you so much for all the work that you do.
Thank you, Meg. I'm so honored to be here.